The diesel locomotive, known today as the very piece of technology that replaced steam, is often looked at as a villain of railroading. Despite this, each one had its own unique history and was unique in its own way. Eventually, new diesel designs gained stride, and by no means slowly. By the 90s, some of the locomotives that were first generation and some early second generation would fade into history. Because of this, most of them would meet the fate of the scrapper's torch like their steam brethren did before them. Thankfully, some would be kept for future generations at museums and tourist railroads, but very few would be seen doing the very tasks they were designed for. Nevertheless, in every statistic, there's an anomaly. EMD, or General Motors, is well known today as one of the largest locomotive manufacturers to date. Today, they're often seen as a company that had a tragic downfall in the making of diesel locomotives, being eventually overtaken by GE in locomotive sales and production. However, they weren't always this way. Back in the early days, they were known as the main company that brought many successful diesel locomotive designs that replaced many steam and electric locomotives, and can even be seen still running to this very day. Out of the many kinds of diesel locomotive designs, there is one that stood out from all the rest and is often seen as a cockroach to some degree, due to them never truly fading away. That locomotive being the Electromotive Division GP9. The Electromotive Division GP9 is a 4-axle diesel locomotive that was built between 1954 and 1963. The design was meant to be a successor to the already popular GP7, which was already fading out in production. When put together side by side, the two locomotive designs look almost identical to each other. However, there was a difference in the size of the radiator fans. Besides the radiator fans, the GP9s also had a different innard when compared to their early GP7 counterparts. The GP7s were built with an older 567B 16-cylinder prime mover that produced around 1500 horsepower. When the GP9s were constructed, they would have an improved prime mover being the 567C variant. This variant would be brought out a year before the GP9 started production. This particular prime mover would be known as one of the most successful EMD prime movers due to it being the most mass-produced in the history of EMD. EMD would use the 567C in a wide variety of motive power like the GP9s, SD9s, F9s, E9s, and some various yard switchers. The railroads would come to like this new kind of prime mover and found it to be extremely reliable and versatile. So much so that they would order a ton of new locomotives with this particular engine. The most prominent of these orders would be the GP9s. In the 11 years of production, 4,092 GP9s would be constructed, along with 165 B units. This would make the GP9 the most mass-produced first-generation diesel of any locomotive manufacturer. Most of the GP9s would be built for American railroads, but some would be built for other countries such as Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. Railroads would use the GP9s to a wide variety of uses. These included branch line trains, yard duties, fast freight trains, heavy freight trains, and even fast passenger trains. As good as these locomotives were, however, railroads would start replacing them in the 70s and the 80s when new locomotive designs came into the picture. This included designs like the GP30, GP35s, and even some of the larger diesels like the SD40s. Because of this, railroads would trade in these earlier GP9s to EMD for newer motive power. If the locomotives were not traded to the EMD Corporation, the engines would either be sold for scrap, sold, or even rebuilt into new locomotives to extend their working lives. Some of these rebuilds would be known as the GP15Cs, the GP10s, the GP20s, and the GP9Es and the GP9Rs. As for the GP9s that were not scrapped or rebuilt, the remaining engines would be sold to other short-line railroads. Despite all these outcomes, a few would be saved from the torch. Some locomotives would be sold to other tourist railroads to use them on excursion service, and some engines would be placed on static display at museums or city parks. Now that I've talked about the GP9s, let's talk about a certain one that's still in use today after 70 years of service. Here we are at the Washington, Idaho, and Montana Railroad in Potlatch, Idaho. The railroad is a 13-mile-long freight railroad that typically hauls lumber products from the Bennett Lumber Company in Princeton, Idaho, to the Spokane, Spranger, and Palouse Railroad's interchange in Palouse, Washington. Hauling their trains is the 7-decade-old GP9 built way back in April of 1956. This locomotive started its life as Great Northern No. 686, being one of 79 GP9s delivered to the railroad. When the locomotive was first delivered, it would be painted in the Great Northern's Empire Builder paint scheme, which was first debuted in 1941. The locomotive's service life was uneventful, being used for various freight services and yard duties on many parts of the GN system. Eventually, the locomotive would be stationed around Hilliard in the 1960s, and would receive the last two paint schemes the locomotive would carry on the GN. 686 would gain the simplified builder scheme in the early 1960s, and the later sky blue paint scheme around 1968 before the BN merger. Eventually, when the BN gained ownership of the GN, all the locomotives would be renumbered to signify they were now under Burlington Northern ownership. In 1970, the 686 would follow this renumbering program, receiving the new number that we know today. The locomotive, now known as 1838, would be stationed hauling locals out of Hilliard and possibly on the P&L branch for some time, until being transferred to the Midwest in the mid-1970s. This was due to the Burlington Northern finding out that the dynamic GP9s worked better for the constant grades in the West Coast, while the non-dynamic GP9s proved to work better for the flat and relatively level terrains of the Midwest. The locomotive would continue its duties until the 1980s, when the Burlington Northern began retiring and rebuilding some of its earlier motive power. In January of 1985, the Burlington Northern would sell 1838 and 5 other Great Northern GP9s to the Central Montana Railroad in Denton, Montana. When she began service for the railroad, the locomotive would be painted in the CMR's dark blue paint scheme, along with sister locomotive 1809. These would be the only two GP9s to ever wear this paint scheme, while the others received a lighter blue paint scheme. The blue looked very similar to the Montana Rail Links blue, which brought misconceptions that the CMR's blue was based off of Montana Rail Links, despite the GP9s being delivered 2 years before Montana Rail Link was formed. 1838 would run for the CMR for many years, being used on a variety of freight services and occasionally dinner trains, until the railroad traded it and 2 other GP9s to the Western Rail Incorporated for 2 GP38-3s in 2020. Western Rail would receive 1838 along with 1809 and 1817 and move them to the company's headquarters in Airway Heights. Since 1838 was in best condition out of the 3 engines, they did some minor repairs and brought the locomotive back to service. The locomotive's new assignment was to become a leaser unit for the company and eventually go for a resale. As for the other 2 GP9 locomotives, 1809 would be cosmetically restored by Western Rail and placed on static display in Kalispell, Montana. 1817, however, would get the short end of the stick, being used as spare parts and eventually cut up for scrap in 2020. Back to 1838, the locomotive wouldn't receive much use from Western Rail until 2023, when the newly formed Washington, Idaho, and Montana Railroad discovered the locomotive. WIM would then make a deal with Western Rail and decide to long-term lease the 1838 with the intent of eventually buying out the locomotive. The locomotive would first go under test runs at the Inland Northwest Rail Museum for a few months in 2024, and then be moved to WIM's headquarters in early 2025. Ever since then, it has hauled lumber trains and maintenance of way trains to this very day, proving to be a very reliable asset to the railroad. And that's the amazing part. There is other short line railroads out there, but not many of them have any high hood motive power. Yes, some short lines may have other GP9s and other various first generation diesels, but the WIM, I do believe, is one of only a couple of short line railroads that still use a high hood GP9 at all, let alone one that has been running almost constantly. All the other ones that are out there are ones that are chop nose. And it really just goes to show that not all railroads need modern motive power to be successful. Sometimes all you need is an old Jeep to get the job done.
My grandkids won't ever have to see life on that Great Northern Railroad line.